Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and welcome, Minister, again, and thank you, Fianna Fáil, for bringing this bill to the private member's bill to the House today. What does a right to housing mean? The Simon community defines a right to housing as, at the most basic, the right to have your housing needs met by the state if you cannot meet them from your own resources. In 2020, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission carried out a survey. 82% of the people in this country believed that such a right should be a human right. In 2020, 8,200 people, including dependents, were homeless in this country. In 2020, if there had been a right to housing in our Constitution, the government would have been guilty of infringing on the rights of 8,200 times. Every good argument has two sides, and in this case of whether the Irish Constitution should have a right to housing, the two sides of the argument must be carefully considered. Many are in favour of a right to housing. Home for Good is a group of organisations and individuals who believe that the constitutional change is an essential underpinning of any successful programme to tackle our housing and homeless crisis. The group argues in favour of a right to housing. They consider the proposed right to be necessary to rebalance the Irish Constitution. Is the Constitution imbalanced? Currently, Bunreacht na Éireann expressly protects private property in Article 43 and states that such private property rights can only be infringed on the purpose of the common good. However, there is no definition of the common good. As the Home for Good position paper explains, this has had consequences in the past. On 12 separate occasions over recent years, it has been found that pending legislation to reform Ireland's housing crisis has failed to progress in the Dáil when Article 43 was raised as a barrier. 12 pieces of legislation which could have helped one of all those 8,200 homeless people in this country. Or, on the other side of the argument, was there 12 pieces of legislation that would have compromised private property rights of our citizens? Home for Good claims that the Constitution is imbalanced, but in the interest of balancing rather than shifting the weight, it should be asked, what consequences do we face if the Irish people vote in favour of a constitutional right to housing? A vote in favour of a right to housing would make the right of an enumerated right. This is a right outlined and enshrined in the Constitution. The Irish Constitution has several enumerated rights, such as the right to freedom of assembly, the right to association, the right to freedom of speech. But there are other rights which we have, rights which are not enshrined in the constitutions. These are unenumerated rights. The rights to marry, the rights to privacy, the rights to earn a living and the rights to bodily integrity are examples of unenumerated rights. These are rights which are not written in the Constitution, but instead are derived from rights which are enumerated. In the case of McGee and Attorney General, the right to marital privacy was derived from the protection of marriage in Article 41 and the protection of personal rights in Article 40.3. In a recent Supreme Court case, it was speculated that the rights to a clean and healthy environment could be derived from Article 10, protections on the ownership of natural resources and state property, as well as other constitutional protections of the home. If the right to housing becomes an enumerated right, what rights will the courts derive from it? New rights that the governments and the people of Ireland do not get a say on. The Dáil voted against the introduction of a proposed right to housing in 2017, and maybe, as the Home for Good paper suggests, this was laziness. It is easier to use Article 43 as an excuse than to reform. Or maybe it was becoming creating rights have consequences and creating rights create responsibilities. The right to housing is being sold to us as a solution to a problem which we have, but is it? The UN has recognised the right to adequate housing as a fundamental human right. The International Covenant on economic, social and cultural rights, which Ireland has ratified, includes a right to adequate housing in Article 11. Countries include South Africa, Scotland and France have incorporated a right to adequate housing into their constitution. Nonetheless, homelessness still exists worldwide. Nonetheless, housing markets still have supply shortages and rising demands. Nonetheless, problems remain. It is not a negative, but a cautious note I want to impart here as we consider today's private member's bill. Creating a right to housing does not only create a right to housing. It empowers the courts to create rights that go beyond a right to housing. And with rights comes responsibilities. Responsibilities which the government, businesses and taxpayers would have to carry. And with rights do come solutions. The ERSI do not recommend a right to housing. They recommend we double our investment in it. They recommend building 35,000 homes a year when we are only building 15 to 20. They recommend we borrow more, build more. With rights only comes responsibility. And is this government prepared to take on such responsibility? I doubt it.